And on this Labor Day weekend, I want to talk about your place, my place in this world. And there's really no better person to look at than Moses. And the psalm that we're going to read together here in just a moment is titled, A Prayer of Moses, the Man of God. This is the oldest psalm that we have, and it's the only psalm written by Moses. Now, Father Terry was here last week. He's a scholar on the Psalms, and what did he say about honesty and the Psalms? He said that they're raw with emotion, right? That the psalmists are praying their heart and their mind as the heart and the mind is. Not as we should be, not as we could be, but just as we are. Raw emotion. And you're going to discover here in just a moment, in case you haven't read this psalm before. I haven't read it a lot, to be honest, and I've never preached on it before. And the more I got into it this week, the more I was just blown away by how Moses is such a model for us. So we're going to read this together, if we may, and then I may stop at one point and do a little commentary. But I want to invite you to do one thing as we're reading. Can you pay attention, please, to Moses' emotion, to his raw feelings, his direct thoughts? Moses didn't take this prayer and hand it to his teacher of grammar and say, "Can you clean this up for me?" It's also in English, and so you're not going to get what Moses is really trying to do here. That's my job today. So let's read together, shall we? Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now let's just pause for a moment and say that here's one thing that you'll need to know about the Psalms, because it helps make sense of them. Now, you look at that and you say, well, there's nothing raw about that, and that's because the psalmists always begin with the foundation. This is where he will come back over and over and over again and say, this is what I believe about God. It's the foundation upon which the psalm is built. And then he goes into talking about humanity. Read with me, please, if you would. You turn us back to dust and say, turn back, you mortals, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, or like a watch in the night. Now, here again, the English, turn back, you mortals. There's nothing about that says, wow, he's really upset. Right? So in the Hebrew, it would be like Moses is saying, okay, God, I don't quite understand this. Why is it that people die? And he would be screaming. And if there were a pulpit, he'd be pounding it. And he'd be agonizing. Because he's asking the question, why is it that people die? Now, what Father Terry said last week is so true, that the Psalms are a picture of our lives. Right? Real life. And then he goes on to say, you sweep them away. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. You can read with me, please. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. Now, this is his way of saying, I just don't get it. This is way too short. And then he really gets mad. For we are consumed by your anger, by your wrath we are overwhelmed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance. Now, can I put this in plain English? This gets us into the original language of the Hebrew. This is where he is saying, God, I do not understand. I am so incredibly mad about the fact that you are mad. And he's interpreting everything that has happened in his life as a result of God's wrath. Now be clear, this is not saying that God is wrathful. This is saying his interpretation of God's action is a result of the fact that God is mad. Everybody's mad, including Moses. Now you're saying, well, what does this have to do with finding your place in this world? Hold on. For all our days are under your wrath. Over and over he refers to God's wrath and anger. Our years come to an end like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years or perhaps 80 if we are strong. Even then their span is only toil and trouble. They are soon gone and we fly away. And please hear the emotion of Moses as he's complaining about the fact that he doesn't get why things are the way they are. This life is too short. There's too much trouble. Before you know it, it's all gone. Do you hear the emotion? Who considers the power of your anger? You hear it again? The wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. So teach us to count our days so that we may gain a wise heart. Turn, O Lord. How long? This one in Hebrew is, okay, God, I cannot stand it anymore. It's like this. Or like this. See, that's where Moses is. He just cannot stand it anymore. Turn, O Lord, how long? Have compassion on your servants. And this isn't, would you please, Lord God, would you please have compassion on your servants? Or would you please just be nice and just be so gracious? No. Imagine a person out in a field screaming their lungs out of anger, out of frustration, out of turmoil, out of distress, out of depression, and that's Moses. Goes on to say, make us glad as many days as you have afflicted us. See, he's really mad at God, saying, why do you keep loading it on? And as many years as we have seen evil, let your work be manifest to your servants and your glorious power to their children. And is typical of all the Psalms. You start out with the foundation, you go into the distress, you go into the mess. And where does he end? In the place of calm. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and prosper for us the work of our hands. Oh, prosper the work of our hands. Well, Lord, may the words of my mouth and may the thoughts of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you and you alone are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I want to suggest to you today that Moses here, if you were to take his disposition, his place in his life at this moment, he is experiencing soul fatigue. Now, I wonder if any of us might be experiencing soul fatigue. And if you look at Moses and you look at the children of Israel, he was leading them out of slavery into freedom. And when you look at the people of God called the Israelites and you look at Moses, their leader, there's a lot of soul fatigue. And the first lesson that we see in the story, you're going to have to take my word for it because we don't have time to get into it, because after all, I'm talking about being rushed. But the children of God, they're led out of freedom, and what does God do? He takes the long route. And then when they get into the place of freedom, it takes them how many years in order to get to the promised land? 40. But they're in a hurry. They want to get there now. I'm that way. Are you? One of the greatest signs or symptoms of soul fatigue is a frequent or constant sense of feeling rushed. That's why I love what Dr. Swenson, who's written a book titled Margin, He says, just take a look at our lives. We send packages by Federal Express. We use a cell phone by a company called Sprint. We manage our personal finances on Quicken. We schedule our appointments on a day runner. We diet with Slim Fast, and we swim in trunks made by Speedo. What does that say about our culture? It says that our culture is wrapped up into faster, faster, faster. Do any of you ever have that sense that there are not enough hours in the day, that there are too many things to do, too many responsibilities to be met, too many obligations to be carried out, too many things I want to do, there's just not enough time? And what's the problem with that? The faster we go, the soul begins to shrink. And it creates for soul fatigue. And I present to you that's where Moses was. And it is a saboteur of people who want to know what life is all about. Have you ever wondered what your purpose is? Why you're here? Why God put you on earth at this time, in this place? What's that about? Do you ever wonder that? If you don't wonder that, you're lying in the house of the Lord. Everybody does. It's part of the human experience, and it's where Moses is, and I suggest that it is also where most of us live. There's a constant sense of rush, and people who rush are people who worry. Worrying and rushing are two sides to the same coin. And with the people of God called the Israelites, and with us today, what's the problem with hurrying and worrying? It's highly contagious. When you're around people that are hurrying, you're around people that are worrying. And when you're around people that are worrying, you're around people that are hurrying. They go together, and it's contagious. And when we catch it, so we don't savor our food, we devour our food. The next time you eat, maybe in a little bit, how many bites for each amount of food that goes into your mouth? Do you actually taste it? Or do you just do like I do and devour it? And what's the problem? The soul begins to shrink. Here's another sign of soul fatigue, and that's a difficult time making decisions. Difficulty making decisions. We live in a world of choice overload. Don't we? Have you been to the Cheesecake Factory? Their menu is like a book, right? One of the reasons why I like to go to Five Guys, not only is the meat fresh, but guess what? Their menu is very simple. Not a lot of choices. By the way, do you know how many different kinds of shampoos there are? I'll tell you. 1,260. There are shampoos for dry hair. There are shampoos for oily hair, for limp hair, for colored hair, for damaged hair. There's shampoo with egg in it. There's shampoo with beer in it. There's shampoo for dandruff, eczema, psoriasis. There's shampoo to make your hair smell like any kind of fruit and several kinds of vegetables. We live in a world that is overloaded with choice. I went to Dillon's on purpose yesterday afternoon. I went to the toothpaste section and I just counted how many different brands of toothpaste there are. And then within a particular brand like Crest, how many sub-brands are there? And as I was doing it, this worker came up to me and said, "May I help you?" And I said, "Yes, sir. Can you tell me how many different kinds of toothpaste that you have?" He said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I can." And I said, "Well, tell me about this." So we entered into a conversation about this. I said, "So what's it like to work in a store that has this many kinds of toothpaste?" He said, "It's a pain in the neck," only he didn't use neck. Choice overload. The Israelites were right there. God had said, I'm leading you forward. They developed the Back to Egypt Committee and said, do we want to go back where there's food? It includes slavery, but at least we have food. Or do we want to go forward and deal with the unpredictable? Which way are we going to go? Part of them wanted to go this way. Part of them wanted to go that way. That's our lives, isn't it? And it's one of the reasons why Moses was so frustrated, is because he was living with the challenge of too many decisions that had to be made. TV channels, how many are there now? When I was a kid, we had rabbit ears. I'm just curious, any of you under the age of 30, do you even know what rabbit ears are? I'm not talking about a literal rabbit. Right? And you know what we had to do is we put aluminum foil on the edge of the, right? Because we only had 3 channels. One good one. Now, there are 167 different channels with 72,000 programming choices every month. We are so overloaded with choices that it causes the soul to shrink. Here's another one: surplus of information and deficit of wisdom. How much information do we have? More than we need. And yet, would you say that in our day, people walk around saying, we're such a wise people? There's so much wisdom amongst the people today. And what is wisdom? Wisdom is knowing how to live. Wisdom is knowing how to make the most of the times, to take what God has given us and to maximize it in a way that would glorify God and bless people. But when we live in an age of information, there's a gift in that. But there's a point at which we engage in information to the neglect of seeking wisdom. And wisdom only comes from God. And you cannot microwave wisdom. Wisdom does not come to a mind or a heart that is fatigued and worn out and stressed out. You know what God's language is? Silence. If tomorrow morning you get up and spend 10 minutes in silence and just say, here I am, God, you'll be amazed at how that blesses your soul. And God is faithful to give wisdom to anybody who asks for it. And you have to create the time and space where you ask, God, give me wisdom. I pray for wisdom and discernment. Here's another sign or symptom. You see that for the children of Israel, you see they were full of information. They were all full of opinions and ideas, but nobody was seeking wisdom. But they were also struggling in their relationship with God. And so what did they do? They created idols. And what is it about idolatry? Idols are good things that become ultimate things. They were good things, but they became ultimate things because they said, God, you've abandoned us. People create idols, ourselves included, when we feel like God has abandoned us. And therefore, this stagnation or superficiality in our relationship with God comes from a soul that is too busy, that is worrying and hurrying, and the soul just starts to shrink. You know what I believe? Most of us will never renounce our faith, but almost all of us will settle for a mediocre version of our faith. A less than, inch deep, mile wide. Are you keeping track? How many of these symptoms do you have? Here's one that cuts a little deeper. It's impossible, actually impossible, to love well and to be in a hurry. So Larry and I go to the Catholic Care Center once a month. We go for a variety of reasons, one of which is we learn to love well. Because nobody there is in a hurry. And when you're helping them with their book, it's a whole lot easier to take the book and find the page than it is to stand there and to help them finger those pages with arthritis-ridden hands. But to stand there with them and to walk through that hymnal until they come to the page, we're honoring their dignity and we're learning to love them well because we're having to be slow and patient. Little children, do they know when we are entering their world? Yes. How do they know that? Because we love them slowly. Kids know when we're going too fast, don't they? And you see the children of Israel, they were at each other's throats. They were after Moses. They were after Aaron. They were after God. There was nobody on planet Earth they weren't mad at. And it's because they were so experiencing a shrinked soul that they were unable to love well. Can you stand one more? The children of Israel complained and complained and complained, and God gave them manna, and they said, well, this is really... this is, I guess, BTN food, better than nothing. But we're still hungry, God, so He gave them quail, and they got all choked from eating so much quail, and it didn't matter what God did, it was never good enough, and they just complained and complained and complained, and you know who did this in spades is Moses, because he got so frustrated with them. And do you realize that as Moses was leading the people, he was so angry, he was so mad, he was so frustrated, he was experiencing soul fatigue so deeply that he just did what they did, because all of these soul fatigue symptoms are highly contagious. And he complained and complained and complained, and guess what? Those of us who went to the Holy Land, Jan, you remember this. We were on the top of Mount Sinai, and we literally stood at the place of Moses' tomb. And right there, within a short distance, was the promised land, and he didn't get to enter in. I don't think it's because God said, Moses, bad boy. You're not. I don't think that's what was going on. I think Moses complained himself to literal death. That's why all of this is serious business, folks, because what happens to people who experience full soul fatigue is death. And sometimes it's physical, and always it's spiritual and emotional and relational. And the whole being is so less than what God would desire. And we have very little, if any, joy, very little, if any, hope, very little, if any, love, and we don't have any of Zoe life. Now, are you ready for the solution? Or should I just say, come back next week? Now, why am I spending time on this? Because I'm asking the question for all of us, how do we find our place in this world? It is completely, in my humble opinion, connected to how we treat soul fatigue. A fatigued soul cannot make much of a difference in this life. A fatigued soul doesn't bless many people. And I'm going to give you one thing to meditate upon this week. It is simple, but not simplistic. You look for God in what is right before you and in all the places before you. You want to know how to make your soul come alive? You go to the end of the verse, and I'm going to put this Hebrew in plain English. When Moses says, "Let the favor of the Lord God be upon us and prosper for us the work of our hands, O prosper for us the work of our hands," what he is praying and what he is pleading for is that we would find God literally at the end of our fingertips. There are so many people who say to me, "Jeff, I think that I need to take about 10 different tests to find out why I am on this earth." You can take 10 different tests, and it might be frosting, but it is not cake. If you want to know the cake, if you want to know the basic reason why you are in this life at this time, everything that has to do with why you're here is right there literally at the end of your fingers. Do you know what I mean by that? Whatever is in your sphere of influence, right there in your midst, that is the reason you're here. It might be people. It might be situations. It might be challenges. Whatever is right there in your midst is the reason you're here. And guess what our human tendency is? We ignore what's right there in our midst and we go 10 trillion miles away and say, "My purpose is over there." Your purpose might be over there as frosting, but it is not cake. Now, when I say that, do you know what I mean? The primary purpose we are alive at this time in this place is right there within the reach of our hands. So Ruth Ann and Oliver, Jeff is right there within the reach of your hands. That's why you're here. Larry, your son, is right within the reach of your hands. That's why you're here. The other Larry, Camp Horizon, is right within the reach of your hands. I'll close with this. This is a famous painting at the J. Paul Getty Museum in L.A. And I've only been there once, and I missed this. It's good reason to go back, right? This is a famous painting by this man named Rudolf von Ems, titled "The Israelites Collecting Manna from Heaven." And as I close, let me just tell you that manna in Hebrew means, what is it? The manna in our midst should lead us to ask God, what is it that you're doing? What is it that these people are here? What is it that I'm supposed to do? What is it? And look at these Israelites. Now you can see this is only a few. There's so much in this painting, and I'll just touch on a few. You see the balls, that's the manna. And I want you to look at the figures. These are representative of the minor voice, not the major voice. I've reflected the major voice with soul fatigue. These are the minor voices. And I want you to look at their fingers. What's the deal with their finger? Can you see it well enough? They're especially long. And where are they pointed? Up. And what's the point that the painter is making relative to the story of the Israelites in the midst of the manna, in the midst of the what is it? Is that they're pointing, asking God, what is it that you're doing here? And the finger is especially long because it's a symbol of connecting to God, who alone can give us that answer. What are you doing here? What is my place here? And then the second symbol of the painting is that he's trying to communicate that the finger is long because the work of our hands is literally at the end of our fingers. Now, let me just make sure that you're all hearing me. The work of our hands are the people within our reach. That's the cake. Oh God, speak to us in this time of silent prayer.